So in this lecture, we're moving on to poetry, and we'll be looking at two poets over the next few weeks, Tennyson and Christina Rossetti. So poetry in the Victorian period, in some ways, is regarded as a distinct kind of literary form or set of forms or event from that which preceded it, which would be the Romantic period. But in fact, there's really an overlap between the two, certainly in the way we might time the two or think about them in history. Wordsworth, probably the most famous of the English Romantic poets, dies in 1850, which is well into the Victorian period. Victoria coming to the throne in 1837, so technically very much a Victorian. Although maybe the height of the Romantic period is between 1800 and 1820. So there's an overlap between the two. Romantic poetry we would think of as prioritizing a kind of first person lyric, sometimes associated with the sublime and the consideration of landscape, sometimes associated with fantasy, and kind of moving towards the Gothic at times as well. So Tennyson overlaps with the Romantic period. Tennyson was born in 1809. And he's at university at the height of the Romantic period and the height of the popularity of the Romantic poets, so very much influenced by them when he starts writing poetry. On this module then, when we're looking at Tennyson and Christina Rossetti, we'll see some of the influence of the Romantic poets and more particularly perhaps of the politics of the Romantic period. The Romantic poets, particularly affected by the French Revolution and the aftermath of the French Revolution, of philosophies of the sublime, for example, hence the interest in landscape and mountains, and the kind of the regions of Britain in particular, and a kind of post-Gothic sense of the supernatural. And in the Victorian period, those kinds of concerns start to overlap with some of the concerns that become more specific to the Victorian period. So that is about faith and belief in general, what you believe and how to believe in anything. And on the more political side, radicalism, social reform, empire, and the rise of materialism. So there's an overlap between the kind of Romantic mode and the Victorian set of concerns, and it's not always predictable how those two things will interact. So this is Alfred Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, as he's sometimes known. He became a lord later in life. Tennyson came from he was born in 1809, died in 1892. So a very long life and a very public life in Victorian Britain. His family would have been known as a Whiggish family, that is associated with the Whig Party. It's quite difficult to explain in retrospect what the Whigs represented. The main parties at the time of Tennyson's early career were the Whigs and the Tories. And neither of them then are quite what we would think of now. We would think of the Whigs as a bit like the Liberal Democrats as they are now in Britain. And the Tories obviously morph into the Conservative Party and still called Tories. But the distinction between them is not quite as easy for us to see looking back using our contemporary lens. The Whigs have their origins in the parliamentary side in the English Civil War in the 17th century. That is, the Whigs would largely be regarded as sometimes of the kind of middle classes or lower echelons of the landed gentry, but would be very much about limiting the power of the monarch and enhancing the power of Parliament. The Tories, on the other hand, might be seen as more monarchical and more interested in the Lords rather than the Commons. So in a way, a kind of Commons versus Lords model might be one way generally to think of what the Whigs were. Certainly Tennyson's family were Whig. Whether Tennyson was or not is a difficult question. Some critics would see Tennyson as a deeply conservative thinker, and others would see him as a Whig thinker. And in a way, it depends on the issue and the particular time in the 19th century when he is thinking about it. One of the things I want to suggest to you in this lecture is that Tennyson's thinking on heroism is a way for him to think about those extremes of absolute monarchy and absolute revolution, and to think about how you negotiate between those two, with a veering away, particularly from revolution and radical politics, towards something a little more nostalgic and conservative with a small c, but that isn't absolutist in its monarchical way and isn't a return to a kind of pre-Reformation feudalism. So Tennyson is trying to work this out, and part of the interest, I think, in the poems that I'm looking at today is that I think he uses the model and figure of the hero as a way of trying to think about this. So Tennyson's family then were of a kind of Church of England background. Relatively, there were some branches of his family were very well off. His particular branch wasn't particularly. They were a slightly dysfunctional family, particularly because of his father. He had a traditional classical education, and then he went to Cambridge. And when he was at Cambridge, he fell in with a group of young intellectuals there who called themselves very pretentiously the Apostles. They were quite impressive intellectually. And there was a particular influential friendship that he struck up at Cambridge with a man called Arthur Henry Hallam. He was a fellow student. Arthur Henry Hallam became very close friends with Tennyson, became engaged to Tennyson's sister, Emily, and was regarded by many of his friends as a future prime minister, which is quite a claim for someone in their early 20s. Arthur Henry Hallam died at the age of 22 in 1833, and that the death of Hallam is probably the single most influential event in Tennyson's life. It reverberates throughout his poetry for decades afterwards and almost forms his poetry and his outlook on life. Ulysses, for example, the poem that you're looking at in tutorials this week, was written in the immediate aftermath of Hallam's death, and is often thought of as a consideration of that passing, though in quite a complicated way. And the poem that I'll be mainly discussing next week, In Memoriam, is a poem entirely about the death of Arthur Henry Hallam, which took a couple of decades for Tennyson to complete. So Tennyson, early in his poetic career, was relatively successful. And In Memoriam, when it was published, became a kind of sensation in many ways, because it seemed to capture a Victorian fascination with death and memorialization. It was published in 1850, which was the same year that Wordsworth died. Wordsworth had been Poet Laureate up until 1850. And after he died, a new Poet Laureate had to be appointed, and Tennyson was given the role. This turned Tennyson into a very public poet, having to write poems for public occasions, and particularly for the Queen. So he becomes a very public figure at that point, and very famous in Britain, and almost the poet of Victorian Britain. He wrote many types of poetry, but all of them, I think, filter the period. They are influenced by the period that he lives. He's deeply interested in what's happening around him. He's deeply concerned about contemporary Britain, and he writes about it in lots of different ways. Sometimes through myth, as we'll see in a minute, sometimes through writing directly about contemporary Britain. Always interested in the loss of religious faith, in the changing in the social order, sometimes an interest in trying to preserve the class order as it is, and always an anxiety about what progress brings. Even though Britain is expanding, and partly because Britain is expanding in this imperial era, he has an anxiety about what that will mean for a future Britain. To get some sense of how famous Tennyson was, these images here, on the left you can see tickets for the funeral of Lord Tennyson, October the 12th, 1892. He's buried in Westminster Abbey. So this was a massive public event, and it mirrors a previous public event that he had written about, which I'll come to a bit later in the lecture. And you can see that the press reports on his funeral show how elaborate that funeral was. So by 1892, he had become a symbol of Victorian Britain. Now, in regards to starting out on thinking about Tennyson's poetry, I want to begin with a poem of his, which is really two poems joined together. The two poems are the epic and Mort d'Arthur. Mort d'Arthur meaning the death of Arthur. That poem was published in 1842, and a fragment of it turned into part of the Mort d'Arthur part was really the fragment that turned into Tennyson's long epic poem, Idylls or Idylls of the King, depending on how you pronounce it. A book-length poem telling various stories about King Arthur and his knights that was finally completed in 1872. So that's 30 years of compiling this poem. Idylls of the King tells the story of King Arthur. And Tennyson, writing this in the 1830s, is published in 1842, but he's writing it in the 1830s, is picking up on something that was current at the time, an interest in the medieval, and an interest, and particularly in King Arthur, a kind of mythic king of Britain. He probably existed, but had become more of a myth than a reality. Arthurianism in the 19th century, and then a kind of wider umbrella that it sits under of medievalism, is an immense topic. It is a kind of cultural phenomenon. The Victorians were fascinated by King Arthur. They equated their own world in various ways with King Arthur's court and also with medieval Britain as well. And Arthur and medievalism could mean many things to many different people. For some it was nostalgia, for some it was patriotism and a kind of form of nascent nationalism, and all across Europe at the time people were interested in the medieval, particularly medieval histories of their nations, Britain and Germany being the most obvious examples of this, and thinking about their national myths as a way to solidify and uphold the newly forming sense of nation that happens in the 19th century. And King Arthur and the Arthurian stories in Britain is part of this cultural phenomenon. Sometimes it can be adopted by progressive thinkers, by radical thinkers, sometimes by very conservative thinkers, sometimes by religious people who want to go back, to, for example, to a kind of pre-Reformation England. In Tennyson's version of King Arthur, there is a Tennysonian Arthur, an Arthur that is obsessed with his order collapsing, but also offers the opportunity for that order to return. So those are the things that Tennyson is interested in when he thinks about King Arthur primarily. There's also something in everyone who thinks about Arthur in the 19th century, which is the chivalric code, as it's called. Quite what that means is different things, different people, but a lot of it is about gender politics, and a lot of it is about trying to uphold a kind of version of masculinity, or put forward a particular version of masculinity that Arthur and his chivalric code can be seen to represent. To get a sense of how popular a phenomenon medievalism and Arthurianism was, we might just pause for a minute then and look at this particular thing that happened in 1839, which is more or less the time that Tennyson is writing the poem. The Eglinton tournament. Eglinton is in Scotland and was the estate of Lord Eglinton. The Eglinton tournament was a staging of a medieval tournament, at least as imagined in the mind of Lord Eglinton at the time. This was very much a Tory event, and Lord Eglinton, like many other Tories, looked at the coronation of Queen Victoria in 1837 and thought of it as lacking the proper ceremony for a British monarch. And having read Ivanhoe and absorbed the ideas of Walter Scott and put this together with a sense that Britain wasn't chivalric enough, Eglinton came up with this idea of staging a medieval tournament. He imagined this on a massive scale, and in fact it all got a bit out of hand for him. He spent what would today be the equivalent of £4 million sterling on this event, and actually bankrupted himself. He built a bridge on his estate. He built or had formed an enormous island on which this tournament would take place. There would be jousting. He invited 150 members of the House of Lords and other people he thought were proper knights to come to London to discuss the organisation of the event, and he brought along there someone who would make armour for all the knights. Only 40 of those people, 150, decided to go ahead and become jousting knights in the tournament, but the rest of them were put off by the enormous cost of the armour. So the tournament went ahead in 1839, in August 1839. You would think that was probably a good month in which to have something like this. The weather might be nice. It was in a kind of rural Scotland, but a railway, ironically enough, had been built to not far from Eglinton a couple of years before, just stopped a few miles away from Eglinton. So the irony being that this was using the foremost technology of the day in order to get people to a medieval tournament. The whole thing turned into a disaster for Eglinton and for everyone involved, and there was much laughing at it in the radical press. When they went to begin the tournament, there was a massive thunderstorm and rain, and everything turned to mud. So disastrous for the people involved in the jousting, but particularly disastrous for the spectators, because around 200,000 people turned up at this event. He imagined that there would be 2,000, and there was no food for them. The local village couldn't cope with that many people turning up. It was the biggest public spectator event ever in England when it was staged. And so there's lots of comic descriptions of horses getting stuck in the mud and armour creaking and just generally, and lots of umbrellas, slightly out of keeping with the idea of the tournament. But nevertheless, the Eglinton tournament represents something in the early Victorian imagination, which is, in a way, a reaction against the direction that the 19th century is taking, and a desire to turn back to a previous time. And this slide shows you the bridge that Eglinton had made. It's still there, actually, on his estate. The house is a ruin now, but the bridge is still there. And the drawings that he had done are also done in this kind of medieval style as well. He asked people who came along, spectators, to dress in medieval garb too. So it was all a bit of a kind of weird hodgepodge, but nevertheless very meaningful. Because for him and the people involved in it, it represented an attempt to politically bring a kind of halt to the 19th century in the direction it was going in, whereas for other people, medievalism was an attempt to change the direction of religious faith in the 19th century. So what that shows us is that when you, in the 19th century, when you engage in medievalism or Arthurianism, that you're doing something that is immensely meaningful for everyone around you. It's not just an indulgence and it's not just a fantasy. It is politically and socially important. And so Arthurianism becomes a theme of the 19th century. And Tennyson is at the centre of it. Tennyson's Arthurian poems become the kind of gold standard for those in the 19th century who are interested in what Arthur might represent. And there are hundreds and thousands of examples of where Tennyson's poetry or the Arthurian stories more generally filter into Victorian life. This is one example in the Oxford Union, which is what is kind of the students' union of Oxford University. And the building was decorated in the late 1850s by various artists associated with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. We'll come on to them in relation to Christina Rossetti, because her brother was one of the foremost painters in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And they decorated this in the 1850s, and you can see that it's done in a medieval style. The ceiling was painted by William Morris, became a famous wallpaper and furniture designer, as well as a painter and a craftsperson. And the paintings on the wall, which are actually totally invisible during the day because the sun shines in, were done by various painters. But it's just one example of how this, when we think about the Victorian period, we might think of it in a kind of Dickensian way, but an equally valid way is to think of it as a world which is pseudo-medieval. And obviously the chapel in Maynooth University, the old St. Patrick's College chapel, is another example of that. I mentioned it in the first lecture. So here the critic, Roger Simpson, talking about Tennyson and Arthurianism, says, having taken account of the large amount of Arthurian scholarship and literary creation within the early 19th century, we may no longer regard Tennyson as a pioneer of the subject. And this is absolutely right. Tennyson was drawing on, when he writes about King Arthur, as we'll see in a minute, was drawing on the 19th century's interest in Arthur, and recognising that the period was beginning to have a fascination with King Arthur for all kinds of reasons. And Simpson says Arthur's historical setting as a partisan fighter is transmuted in Tennyson's writing into that of a nationalist leader. And again, this is absolutely right. For Tennyson, Arthur is primarily the leader of the Britons, whatever we might think the Britons are. And that's how he sees King Arthur, primarily in terms of nationalism, not primarily in terms of religion or class, for example, but primarily in terms of what he brings to a sense of what Britain might be. So just before I go on to look at the poem, the epic and Morte d'Arthur, this is a quotation from a friend of Tennyson writing to another friend of Tennyson in the 1830s, W.B. Dunn. And Dunn writes to his friend Trench, "We have long sold our birthright to oblivion and neglect. Our rich fountains of legendary tales and patriotic superstition are sealed up. Their echoes have died away on the lips of a manufacturing people." So these were people that Tennyson was talking to in his student days in the 1820s and into the 1830s. And this, in a way, summarises Tennyson's view in the epic in Morte d'Arthur, which is that the we of the British people have sold their birthright, and that they have forgotten the fountains, as it's described here, of their legendary tales. Those fountains have been sealed up. And they've been sealed up because we have become, as Dunn sees it, a manufacturing people. So you see the tension here between the industrial progress of the 19th century as against the legendary tales. And in a sense, that's the people who organised and set up the Eglinton tournament against the people who laughed at it. The Tories versus the Whigs. The Whigs more on the side of the manufacturing people, the people owning the mills and the factories. and the Tories, on the other hand, being those representing some kind of older order that finds it difficult to describe its place within contemporary society. So when we come to look at the epic and Morte d'Arthur, I think this idea by Donne, Tennyson's friend, that you have the legendary tales on the one hand, which is patriotism, are the opposite of the way that Britain has become, which is the country of manufacturing people. And the idea is to unseal the fountains of the legendary tales in order to find a true patriotism. So the epic and Morte d'Arthur are effectively one poem. The epic bookends Morte d'Arthur, so it's a bit of the epic before Morte d'Arthur and then a bit of it after it. And it gives the context for the poem. So let me begin by, we're not going to look at the whole thing, so you can go and look at the whole thing yourselves. I'll take out a couple of bits of it. So I'll begin with this bit. At Francis Allen's on the Christmas Eve, the game of forfeits done, the girls all kissed beneath the sacred bush and passed away. The parson Holmes, the poet Everard Hall, the host and I sat round the vassal bowl, then halfway ebbed. And there we held a talk, how all the old honour had from Christmas gone, or dwindled down to some odd games in some odd nooks like this. So they're at Francis Allen's house on Christmas Eve. The I is the narrator of the poem, of the epic, and the other people there are the parson Holmes and the poet Everard Hall. So there's four of them. They're sitting around at Christmas. They've kissed all the girls beneath the sacred bush, which is the mistletoe, and they're sitting around the vassal bowl. And that term, the vassal bowl, is the first indication of what's to come, because it's an archaic Old English word for a kind of shared bowl of drink, and it's punch in this case. And what they're talking about is how the old honour had from Christmas gone. So already they're thinking of the world as kind of decaying, nostalgically decaying, looking back at how things used to be better in the past. So the narrator goes on to say, till I, tired out with cutting eights that day upon the pond, that means they were all ice skating, where 3 times slipping from the outer edge I bumped the ice in 3 several stars, fell in a doze, and half awake I heard the parson taking wide and wider sweeps, now harping on the church commissioners, now hawking at geology and schism, until I woke and found him settled down upon the general decay of faith right through the world. At home was little left, and none abroad. There was no anchor, none to hold by. So here, after they've all had a drink, the narrator, who's been tired from ice skating all day, and has this wonderful image of, first of all, cutting eights upon the pond so he can round it figure of eights, and then is falling asleep. Here's the parson talking, and the parson taking wide and wider sweeps, almost like an ice skater himself. And what the parson is doing is discussing various contemporary issues. The Church Commissioners was a very contemporary issue about the formation of the Church of England. Geology, as you'll remember from one of the first lectures, was pre-evolution, was the science that was telling the Victorians that the world as they understood it, or had understood it, was not sustainable, that the world was old, that it was slowly formed, and that the literal descriptions, that the descriptions of the formation of the world in the Bible, in Genesis in particular, were untenable. And schism is about religious dispute. And so he settles down upon the general decay of faith right through the world. At home was little left, and none abroad. There was no anchor, none to hold by. Very similar to the way that Tennyson's friend Donne was talking about the world in the previous slide. So as you can see here, Tennyson, by thinking about geology, thinking about the decay of faith, is setting up how this poem will understand its slippage into Arthurianism in a moment. One other thing to point out maybe is that the poet that we're about to hear has an unusual name, Everard, but it's his surname that's most important, Everard Hall, because the hall in medievalism and in medieval culture in general, but particularly for the Victorians looking back at medievalism, the hall was the place where culture happened and where in particular the poets spoke to the kings. So the idea of the hall, and lots of kind of Gothic houses built, big houses built in Britain during the 19th century, prioritised the building of a hall, a kind of mock medieval hall with a large dining table in it, as if this was the kind of centre of medieval culture and the control of the medieval world. So this general decay of faith right through the world and the loss of an anchor is in direct opposition to what is represented by the hall, and the poet Hall is the person who is about to give us his version of the medieval world. So as the discussion goes on, Frank Allen says, "You know," said Frank, "he burnt his epic, his King Arthur, some 12 books." This is about Hall the poet. "Nay, nay," said Hall, "why take the style of those heroic times? For nature brings not back the mastodon, nor we those times. And why should any man remodel models? These 12 books of mine were faint Homeric echoes, nothing worth, mere chaff and draff, much better burnt." So Frank Allen tells the other people in the room that Everard Hall, when he was younger, wrote an entire epic based on King Arthur in 12 books, the proper length for an English epic, just like Paradise Lost. And Hall demurs from that and says, well, it wasn't worth anything. Why should anyone take the style of those heroic times? He wrote the poem, but now reflecting back on it, he thinks, why would anyone take those heroic times as the model for what they do? And has this fascinating line, "For nature brings not back the mastodon." The mastodon being, we came across the word in Dickens as well, I think, the mastodon being a dinosaur. And it's a kind of ironic use of a metaphor which is completely counter to the way this poem is going. So nature doesn't bring back the mastodon, and we shouldn't bring back those times, those heroic times. Why should any man remodel models? He says the 12 books that he wrote were faint Homeric echoes, that is, they were kind of faintly modelled on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. They were worth nothing, and they were much better burnt. And the thing is that we find out that Hall indeed threw his epic into the fire. However, we then find out that some of the manuscript was saved by his friends, and they ask him to read the manuscript, which they have. And the poet, little urged, but with some prelude of disparagement, read, mouthing out his hollow ohs and eyes, deep-chested music, and to this result. So, having disavowed his own poem, he's presented with the remnants of his manuscript, and he decides to go ahead and read it. So now the poem, Tennyson's poem, is ready to launch in to its version of the death of King Arthur. So the main thing that happens in Morte d'Arthur is that Arthur is dying, and with him is Sir Bedivere, and Arthur gives Bedivere his sword and asks Bedivere to go to the lake, the nearby lake, and throw the sword into the lake. And Bedivere refuses. And it's only on the third attempt that Bedivere goes to the lake and throws it in. And as the sword whirs towards the lake, just as it's about to hit the water, a hand appears from inside the lake and catches the sword and draws it into the water. But in the course of the poem, we have this section. Then loudly cried the bold Sir Bedivere, "Ah, my Lord Arthur, whither shall I go? Where shall I hide my forehead and my eyes? For now I see the true old times are dead, when every morning brought a noble chance, and every chance brought out a noble night. Such times have been not since the light that led the holy elders with the gift of myrrh. But now the whole round table is dissolved, which was an image of the mighty world, and I, the last, go forth companionless, and the days darken round me, and the years, among new men, strange faces, other minds." So Bedivere here represents an idea of the dissolution of Arthur's rule, the noble chance, the world, the true times being dead and the noble chance being gone, the round table being dissolved, and him being a lonely hero with no heroic deeds to perform. Arthur's response to Bedivere includes this famous line, "The old order changeth, yielding place to new." And Arthur says, "I am going a long way. With these thou seest." There are kind of women there who are taking Arthur off on a boat. "If indeed I go, for all my mind is clouded with a doubt, to the island valley of Avilion, or Avalon we might call it, where falls not hail or rain or any snow, nor ever wind blows loudly, but it lies deep meadowed, happy, fair, with orchard lawns and bowery hollows crowned with summer sea, where I will heal me of my grievous wound." So Arthur goes off on his boat, and he dies. But the point of Arthur is that he's taken off on the mythical boat by the women to the island of Avalon to die, but also not to die, because the whole point of the myth of King Arthur, and one of the reasons it's so compelling for the Victorians, is that the myth of King Arthur is that he will return, not unlike the figure of Christ. And so, having finished reciting his poem, the Morte d'Arthur, the poem returns back to the contemporary and to the other poem, the epic. And the narrator says that it had perhaps some modern touches here and there, redeemed it from the charge of nothingness. And the narrator again falls asleep, which is a kind of medieval trope in itself. And he dreams that he sees King Arthur like a modern gentleman of stateliest port. And all the people cried, "Arthur is come again, he cannot die." At this 100 bells began to peal, that with the sound I woke and heard indeed the clear church bells ring in the Christmas morn. So the epic ends with a dream, the narrator dreaming of King Arthur coming back like a modern gentleman of stateliest port. And stateliest is an interesting word here, because in one way port means how he carried himself, and stateliest means in some ways dignified. But that word also embodies within it state. So Arthur becomes the kind of symbol of the state, the modern state, and imagined as if the modern state can include a figure like King Arthur and what he represents. So Arthur is come again, he cannot die. And so it ends partly with a dream and partly with a reality. In those last three lines, at this 100 bells began to peal, that with the sound I woke and heard indeed the clear church bells ring in the Christmas morn. So it's not clear whether he heard the bells in his dream or whether he heard the actual bells. And the two worlds of the dream and the contemporary, the modern, are interspersed and intermingled at the end of the poem. So the poem moves towards imagining King Arthur as a modern gentleman, of the possibility of writing a poem about King Arthur, which has some modern touches here and there, and therefore redeems it from the charge of being nothing. And so Tennyson is here playing with the idea that Arthur might be remodeled, that Arthur might be relevant, and in fact, dramatising himself, in effect, as the poet Everard Hall, he's trying to work out in this poem, this book-ended, doubled poem, whether it's possible to write a modern epic of King Arthur. And in fact, that's exactly what he goes on to do, a book-length poem about King Arthur, very much about a Victorian version of King Arthur, although set in the medieval period, but reflecting on what King Arthur might mean for the Victorians. So King Arthur is one kind of hero, and Arthur represents many things. He represents chivalry, he represents order, he represents Christian faith of a particular kind, he represents a class structure, and he represents masculinity. And to the Victorians, that can be many different things. Each of those aspects of Arthur are seen in different ways. But for Tennyson, the point, in a sense, is that embodied in one person, one man, in particular one man, can be the epitome of a kind of social order and a future based on the past that Tennyson can identify with. So Tennyson goes on doing his Arthurianism throughout the period, but he also has an interest in other kinds of heroism, and heroism as an antidote to the materialism that he identifies in the 19th century. For Tennyson, like many people who live in what's effectively a post-war period, the idea of the hero is very compelling. There were wars during Tennyson's life, and we'll talk about one of them towards the end. But primarily in the early part of Tennyson's adult life, he's living in a post-war Europe. Europe had been convulsed by war from the French Revolution and the couple of decades following that, particularly with the rise of Napoleon in France. Britain had been at war with France, and all the European powers had been at war, mainly most of them with France, if they weren't invaded by France, for Tennyson's early life. And this shadow of the Napoleonic Wars lay over Tennyson's early adult life. Thomas Carlyle, one of the great and kind of eccentric Victorian philosophers, in 1841 wrote what became a famous and sometimes parodied book on heroes, hero worship, and the heroic. And he ends that book by discussing Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon Bonaparte became the ruler of France after the French Revolution, and led France to become one of the great European power for 15 years or so. Invaded most of what we would today think of as Western Europe, and tried to invade Russia famously and didn't succeed. And for Carlyle, Napoleon was the last hero, the last great man, as he calls him here. Carlyle has an extraordinary prose style, as you'll see from this little excerpt of the very end of this book. He says about Napoleon, he had gone that way of his, and nature also had gone her way. Having once parted with reality, he tumbles helpless in vacuity. No rescue for him. He had to sink there mournfully as man seldom did, and break his great heart and die. This poor Napoleon, a great implement too soon wasted till it was useless, our last great man. And Carlyle, while not actually a fan of Napoleon, sees him as the last great man. He's finishing off his book and finishing off the idea of the hero, and thinks that there will be no more heroes after Napoleon, no more great men of that kind. And in some ways that's similar to Tennyson, but Tennyson is very reluctant to lose his heroes forever. Hence he's fascinated by the idea of the return of King Arthur. Now, as it happened, Tennyson became Poet Laureate in 1851 after the death of Wordsworth in 1850. And one of his first great public duties as Poet Laureate was to write a poem to commemorate the death of the Duke of Wellington. The reason that the Duke of Wellington is important in this context is that the Duke of Wellington was the person who, in the British mind, was the hero who had defeated Napoleon. The Duke of Wellington, that's him on the right there, actually born in Dublin famously, was a British general. He became famous in particular during the Peninsular War, which is part of the Napoleonic Wars. Peninsular Wars were fought in Portugal and Spain, with Portugal, Spain and the United Kingdom banded together to fight against the French Empire. The French took control of large parts of Spain under Napoleon, and the British helped the Portuguese and the Spanish to fight the French, not entirely altruistically, but that was what happened. So that's how Wellington became famous initially. But Wellington's real fame came at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and where Napoleon was finally defeated. It's a very long story. If you don't know the story, Napoleon defeated once, captured, sent off to Elba, an island in the Mediterranean, and then he comes back, and there's another war with the British and the Prussians in particular, and the Dutch, and the Battle of Waterloo, which was in Dutch territory at the time, it's now Belgium, on the 18th of June 1815. Probably the most important single moment for Britain in the 19th century, the Battle of Waterloo. It sets them up for the rest of the period. It becomes a kind of key moment in the mythology of British military, and still is today. Along with Trafalgar earlier there was a naval battle earlier in the century. And this depiction here by Peinemann of the Battle of Waterloo, which is now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, shows Wellington on the horse in the middle, his horse famously called Copenhagen, frothing at the mouth there, and Wellington with the light shining on his face, arriving just as the news comes that the Prussians have arrived on the battlefield, and this will lead to the ultimate defeat of the Napoleonic forces. And the Prince of Orange is down there on the bottom left-hand side, also with light on his face, because it was a painting given to the Dutch. He'd been wounded, and he looks on as his forces have joined with the British in order to finally defeat Napoleon. So the Battle of Waterloo becomes the thing that Wellington is most famous for. And for the British, this is Wellington sending Bonaparte off to his final destination in the South Atlantic on St. Helena. And it's the absolute defeat of Bonaparte. So Wellington becomes the hero of the British Empire in the 19th century. It's hard to imagine someone more important. Just as a small interlude, this image was circulated in the 19th century, was immensely popular, and it shows something very, very strange, which is the Duke of Wellington, after he retired from public life, and it's worth pointing out that he was Prime Minister of Britain twice after Waterloo, he lived to be a good age, and one of the things he was interested in were public entertainments. He loved the Great Exhibition, for example, and visited it every day, apparently. He liked circuses, and he was also interested in Madame Tussauds, which is the waxworks in London, still there, and actually was a supporter of the waxworks. And when Napoleon died, the owners of Madame Tussauds bought up some of Napoleon's actual relics, things that were owned by Napoleon, and they had a waxwork made of Napoleon on his deathbed, reconstructed from the house on St. Helena that he was imprisoned on. And they reconstructed Napoleon's death with Napoleon as a waxwork figure in London in Madame Tussauds. And the story goes that Madame Tussauds' son, who was then running the waxworks, entered the Napoleon room one day and found an old man gazing reverently at Napoleon's waxwork, and realised that the old man was the Duke of Wellington. So you have this wonderfully odd moment of the real Duke of Wellington looking at the fake Napoleon, who he defeated at Waterloo nearly 30 years earlier. And Tussauds, being very aware of the potential publicity involved in this, had a painting done of the Duke of Wellington looking at Napoleon with the Duke of Wellington's agreement. In fact, he sat for the portrait painter. And then this was engraved and was sent all around the world, and the Napoleon room became even more popular after that. So, when the Duke of Wellington died, it was arranged that he would be buried in St. Paul's Cathedral. Nelson was already buried there, the other great hero of the Napoleonic Wars, British hero of the Napoleonic Wars. And there was to be a state funeral. Now, state funerals are rarely accorded in Britain to anyone other than royalty. So this elevated Wellington to the level of royalty. And not everyone agreed that this was a good idea. Dickens, for example, writing in Household Words in an article, Trading in Death, writes about the funeral. And it's particularly apoplectic about the number of letters written by Wellington to private individuals that are being publicly advertised as for sale in the newspapers, along with tickets for the funeral and tickets for places along the funeral walk where the funeral is going to be passing by. So people who had balconies were selling spaces on their balconies to see the Duke of Wellington's body being carried past on its way to St. Paul's. So Dickens was disgusted by this, and in this article in Household Words, he writes, "We believe that a state funeral at this time of day, apart from the mischievously confusing effect it has in the general mind as to the necessary union of funeral expense and pomp with funeral respect, and the consequent injury it may do to the cause of a great reform most necessary for the benefit of all classes in society, is in itself so plainly a pretence of being what it is not. It is so unreal, such a substitution of the form for the substance. It is so cut and dried and stale. It is such a palpably got-up theatrical trick that it puts the dread solemnity of death to flight and encourages these shameless traders in their dealings on the very coffin lid of departed greatness." So Dickens, appalled by the way that the funeral was being organised. But Tennyson was in a slightly more difficult position. The funeral of the Duke of Wellington was not just to be a state occasion, it was kind of taken over by the royal family. And in fact, the funeral was substantially delayed because Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, decided that he himself would design what was called the funeral car. And this is it here. It was the carriage on which the coffin was to be rested as it was brought to St. Paul's. So it took Albert a while to design it. He then wanted to oversee the manufacturing of it. It was made symbolically from bronze captured in cannon form at Waterloo, melted down, the French cannons, melted down and made into Wellington's funeral car. Now, kind of comically, the car got stuck on the Mall, and it took 60 policemen to lift it out of the rut that it got into. It took 12 horses to pull it because it was so heavy. And the whole funeral on the day was massively delayed because of the car. And Dickens was equally scathing about the design of the car, as indeed was Thomas Carlyle. All that said, the funeral of the Duke of Wellington was seen by an estimated 1.5 million people in London on the day. The procession seen by 1.5 million people as the body was taken to St Paul's Cathedral. So when Tennyson comes to write his poem, Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington, this isn't just a poem about someone who has died. This is an intervention in an enormous public event. It's Tennyson appearing in a public way as the official poet laureate, having to say something about the greatest hero of the day. And what's interesting about the poem, I think, is that it, first of all, praises Wellington, as you would expect, and it's an unmitigated praise of Wellington. But it is also a consideration of what Wellington might mean to the age. And more interesting, I think, is that it is a poem in which Tennyson is confident enough to try to deflect Wellington towards a version of heroism that Tennyson himself can believe in. So this is how the poem begins. And this is the original 1852 version. The later versions, the 1853 version, is slightly different, and later versions are different again. For example, the "let us" here disappears in some of the later versions. Let us bury the great Duke with an empire's lamentation. Let us bury the great Duke to the noise of the mourning of a mighty nation. When laurel garlanded leaders fall, and warriors carry the warrior's pall, and sorrow darkens hamlet and hall. So a few things to say about this. First of all, you see the use of that word hall again, the medieval word, and symbolically I'm thinking back to what the hall represents, the hamlet and the hall being quite a quaint version of what Britain is, not the city and the town, but the hamlet and the hall, already medievalizing. The poem is an ode, which is a classical form, that is a Greek and Latin form of poetry. And Tennyson was classically educated, so one of the things he does here is try to draw on his classical education in writing this. He's not writing it in a kind of typically English poetic form. He writes it more in a kind of imitation of a Greek or Roman ode. And if you think back to the epic of Morte d'Arthur I was talking about a minute ago, you'll have noticed, I hope, that that's written in blank verse, which is very much an English poetic form. This poem is not written in that kind of typically English form. And you can see that by looking at the unusual stress patterns in some of the lines. So the straight lines here are accented syllables, and the kind of flattened out U's are the unaccented syllables. Let us bury the great Duke with an empire's lamentation. And that other line there, to the noise of the mourning of a mighty nation. You can hear the rhythms, I hope, of those lines, but they're not the standard rhythms of English poetry. And this is what Tennyson is doing. He's using, in particular, poetic feet, which are certainly found in English poetry, but not necessarily in these combinations usually. And in particular, the anapestic feet in the fourth line there, to the noise of the morning, or something that he thinks of as a classical form. So he's writing this as if the Duke of Wellington is a classical hero who is being buried. If in King Arthur his model is the contemporary hero and King Arthur, here's the contemporary hero and the Greek warrior. In the line just highlighted there, just before the beginning of section 2, and sorrow darkens hamlet and hall, he's reverting to the I am and then the anapaest, but the I am is the what we would expect to see in English poetry that is quite formal. That is the unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed pattern. It's the pattern, obviously, of Shakespeare's blank verse, for example, but also the standard pattern of English poetry. So having started out with this kind of Greek poetic metre, or almost like a parody of Greek poetic metre, he reverts towards the end of the section to something that is much more obviously English, and talks about the hamlet and the hall there, because that brings us back to his version of Old England. Now the poem goes on in a way that you might say the poem kills Wellington, or considers Wellington's death many, many times, over and over in its different sections. It's quite a long poem, broken into different sections, and it's constantly talking about how Wellington is dead. And in that sense, it's written after the publication of In Memoriam, which we'll talk about next week. In Memoriam being a poem in which death is considered section by section, and grief is set out as a kind of circular, unending process. And here too, the death is considered and then reconsidered and then reconsidered again. But each time he does it, I think he's trying to move towards some way of understanding how this death can be seen as a public event and something that can be then used to think about the future. So section 3 begins like this. Lead out the pageant sad and slow, as fits an universal woe. Let the long, long procession go, and let the sorrowing crowd about it grow, and let the mournful martial music blow. The last great Englishman is low. At the centre of this, rhythmically, is the penultimate line there, let the mournful martial music blow. You can hear the rhythm of that, the stressed, unstressed rhythm, but the stress is the most important thing. Mournful, martial, music, blow. So this is setting out the kind of steps of the funeral march, sad and slow, as it says in the first line. So even in the first line, we're getting the stresses lead out the pageant sad and slow. And the word slow then becomes the rhyming word. The word slow becomes the rhyming word, used again and again here. Slow, woe, grow, blow, low. So it's got that rhythm which is trying to achieve mournful martial music, blow. And the last great Englishman is low. 5 stresses in the line, and really coming down to a slowing down the march. But also this idea of the last great Englishman is a key to this poem. It's a bit like Carlyle saying that Napoleon was the last great man, almost the same phrase. And Tennyson doesn't want to believe that the last great Englishman is low. He wants to believe, as he does with King Arthur, that it's possible for not for the man to be resurrected, but for the idea to continue. So in section 4, he says, mourn, for to us he seems the last, going back to this idea of the last great man. But what I want to point out to you is the way that he thinks of this last great man. Beginning at line 4. Mourn for the man of long enduring blood. That's his heritage. The statesman warrior, moderate, resolute, whole in himself, a common good. Now, this idea of the statesman warrior might seem quite straightforward, but again that word state is being used. And the word state, as it was, we saw it also then used about the modern Arthur, is Tennyson's way of beginning to think about what a modern hero might be. That is, someone who represents the state. And this, I think, is crucial because it's the state rather than the nation. And the nation can be seen as embodied in the figure of the monarch, but the state includes the people. And what Tennyson is constantly trying to negotiate is the difference, and I'll show it to you again in a minute in this poem, the difference between the monarch as the figurehead of a kind of absolute idea of the nation and the people as the nation itself. And the state is the thing that binds them together. So in the other underlined line that I have there, which praises Wellington for being great in council and great in war. And council is about politics. That is, he was a great politician and he was a great general. And that idea of the politician who is also the warrior, the statesman warrior, great in council, great in war, two things together. Saying that the contemporary hero needs to have that ability to be the warrior, to be the person who yields the sword, but also the person who is able to control wisely, common sense is the term that's used here, to be the wise statesman, which is exactly the way Tennyson thinks of King Arthur, not just as a warrior, but as a great statesman. So this poem is moving towards thinking about Wellington as the embodiment of an ideal of the contemporary hero, an ideal that can live on after him. The other little bit that I've highlighted there is just slightly amusing in a way. This poem never mentions Napoleon, because Napoleon was so hated by the British, but also completely fascinating for them, that Tennyson couldn't bring himself to name Napoleon. So this line, the great world victor's victor will be seen no more, will be seen no more because he's just died. But the world victor's victor, well, the world victor is Napoleon because he conquered the world except Britain, and the victor of the world victor is Wellington. So this is a very roundabout way of not actually naming Napoleon in the Ode on the Death of the Duke of Wellington. In section 5, just to point out that last bit down there, while the bell is tolling here again and again, the sounds of death, the tolling bell is mentioned twice. The towering car, the sable steeds. While he was writing the poem, Tennyson knew that Prince Albert's designed car was going to be pulling the coffin, and it was going to be pulled by 12 black horses. Those are sable steeds. So he gets in his little bit about the royal family there to keep them happy. But this is a bit that I think where we really see Tennyson unfold his idea of what the contemporary hero and what contemporary Britain needs of a contemporary hero. A people's voice we are a people yet, though all men else their nobler dreams forget, confused by brainless mobs and lawless powers. We have a voice with which to pay the debt of most unbounded reverence and regret to those great men who fought and kept it ours. O statesmen, guard us, guard the eye, the soul of Europe, keep our noble England whole, and save the one true seed of freedom sown betwixt a people and their ancient throne. That sober freedom out of which there springs our loyal passion for our temperate kings. Now, one of the things you'll see that's happened here with the verse as we're coming towards the end is that it's moved into rhyming couplets. It's picked up speed. It's lost that kind of slow tread that it had before. Now it's coming to a conclusion. It's coming to a kind of triumphant conclusion, but a very particular conclusion. A people's voice, we are a people yet. So this idea that Britain, the Britons are still a singular people, a national people. And it says, though all men else their nobler dreams forget. So some men forget the nobler dreams, and some of them are confused by brainless mobs and lawless powers. So that's a kind of dissing of the radicals at the time. And this is all after the 1848 revolutions and the Chartist uprising in Britain. So it's really a kind of anti-left moment here. He says, we have a voice. So that's that the Britons have a voice. And he returns to this idea of the statesman. O statesmen, guard us, guard the eye, the soul of Europe, keep our noble England whole. So he's trying to avoid this splitting of England. And the splitting happens in two ways, or might happen in two ways. One of it clearly is that the radicals will split England. And that's why he calls them brainless and lawless, because he wants to dismiss them. But also, he doesn't want there to be a split betwixt a people and their ancient throne. That is, he wants the monarchy to be kept close to the people. Not the people to be kept close to the monarchy, but the monarchy to be kept close to the people. Because that word their ancient throne, the throne belongs to the people. And this brings us back to this idea of Tennyson as a Whig, that the parliamentary, the Commons, is the thing that has ultimate power. That the throne is something that belongs to the people and not to the royal family. And therefore he talks about, in the last line quoted there, our loyal passion for our temperate kings, that is, kings who make good decisions, not absolute monarchs, but kings, that is, monarchs who are temperate. And in the final section of the poem, in its later editions, Tennyson goes even further and thinks about this idea of a Britain which can negotiate its way between the radicals and the monarchists through this kind of state, this focus on the state as the thing that holds together the nation, by pitting that against the great powers of nature. And here he's thinking about, we saw geology and schism in the previous poem, the epic, and here in line 4, though world on world in myriads rule round us, each with different powers and other forms of life than ours, but no we greater than the soul. These are the giant ages that heave the hill, he says in the first line, the forces of geology. So despite all of that, the people come to mourn their hero, and we've seen that he is a hero who can be a model for the future. And the poem ends here, the mortal disappears, ashes to ashes, dust to dust from the funeral ceremony. He is gone who seemed so great. So, we've had two types of hero so far, but those two types of hero, Arthur and the Duke of Wellington, share some common features. That is, they are models of how the state should function, and not as an absolute monarchy, nor as a radical and progressive form, but as something that is conservative with a small c, that holds together the social order, and doesn't allow progress, in quotation marks, to get out of control. It's based on an idea of patriotism, blending internationalism. It's based on an idea of maintaining the social class system as it is, and it's based on a fear of unbridled progress and materialism. It also has within it the idea that the hero contra Carlyle can, at least the model of the hero, can continue into the rest of the 19th century. So I want to finish off by just pointing you towards one other poem in which Tennyson's idea of the hero is immensely challenged by events. And this is the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, which is in some ways his most famous poem. So I'll do this quite quickly because I've gone on for quite a while now. But here on the screen you can see William Howard Russell's news report on the events that led to the charge of the Light Brigade. This happened during the Crimean War in the 1850s. Britain, along with France this time as one of its allies, and the Ottoman Empire, was at war with Russia and Greece. Combined forces of Russia and Greece. It's quite complex to explain why they were at war, but they were at war between 1853 and 1856. And the Charge of the Light Brigade is based around one particular event and in that war, in which, kind of by accident and disastrously, a British light cavalry force, when I say light cavalry force, these were men in simple uniforms on horses carrying sabres, were accidentally given the wrong instructions and were sent into a direct attack on the Russian forces into a valley with Russian artillery on both sides and at the end of the valley. And in effect, around 600 British cavalry rode into a valley and found themselves faced with the entire Russian army, that is 25,000 infantrymen and 4,000 cavalry, and tens, possibly hundreds of cannon. Of the 600 men who rode into the valley, 113 were killed, 134 were wounded, over 300 of the horses were killed. And it was a complete military disaster, and seen as such in Britain, partly because of William Howard Russell's reporting. William Howard Russell was probably the first real war reporter in history, who was with the British forces everywhere they went and sent back his reports to the Times in the 1850s throughout the Crimean War. This famous photograph, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, taken by Roger Fenton in early days of photography, he went the year after the battle, and he took this photograph of where the place where the battle happened, and you can see all the cannonballs still lying around the battlefield long after everyone has departed. It's an interesting sideline about this photograph. It's been proven in recent years that Fenton or someone, all the cannonballs that are on the road there were planted there by Fenton before he took the photograph, because he took a photograph of the road before the cannonballs were there and then after the cannonballs were there, and he's been forensically shown that someone put the cannonballs there to make a better photograph. Nevertheless, it becomes one of the most famous photographs of the Crimean War, partly because there's no one in it, and it's this horrific aftermath of a massacre. So The Charge of the Light Brigade is an immensely popular Tennyson poem, and is one of the poems that he's remembered for. And yet it finds it impossible to get that more complex sense of heroism that we've seen in the previous two poems. The poem begins, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death rode the 600. In this famous bit of it, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of the 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. This is the end of the poem, and this is the best Tennyson can do. out of this military disaster, he simply has to honour the dead, but he can't find a way to turn them into heroes because what they did, in a sense, was so utterly pointless and awful. And the line that sometimes is remembered is the one point where he lets in a kind of weakness and says, "Someone had blundered," and it rhymes with thundered there, as you can see. So the Charge of the Light Brigade becomes a poem that is remembered much more than the Ode on the Death of Duke of Wellington, but I think the Ode on the Death of Duke of Wellington is a much more complex version of public heroism than the Charge of the Light Brigade. But the Charge of the Light Brigade poem became one of the main things that Tennyson is remembered for. And yet it doesn't really capture his sense of the hero properly. And the afterlife of the Charge of the Light Brigade appears in all kinds of strange places. So in Virginia Woolf's modernist novel To the Lighthouse, Mr. Ramsay, the husband of the central character, Mrs. Ramsay, wanders around early in the novel reciting the Charge of the Light Brigade in a slightly threatening way. As it says here, he almost knocked her easel over, coming down upon her, with his hands waving, shouting out, "Boldly we rode on while," which is from Tennyson's poem, but mercifully he turned sharp and rode off, to die gloriously, she supposed, upon the heights of Balaclava. Never was anybody at once so ridiculous and so alarming. And this is Woolf's version of Tennyson, that he is ridiculous. And a kind of comic later version is in the sitcom Hancock's Half Hour, where Tony Hancock, the central character, tries to con the local council into refurbishing his house when he puts up some fake poems by Lord Byron on his wall and pretends that they were written by Lord Byron when he stayed there, which clearly is not going to be true. And at the end, Hancock's friend starts scraping off the wallpaper and finds a real poem, a draft poem written on the wall, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And Hancock, now very sceptical, reads it out, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, and cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them. And Hancock says, Alfred Lord Tennyson doesn't write rubbish like that, actually reciting a Tennyson poem. So while the poem gets dissed by many after it, especially in the 20th century, the poem covers up, I think, a much more complex sense in Tennyson of what it is to be a public poet and what it is that heroism might represent in his society. So to finish off, Lynn O'Brien, writing about Tennyson's heroism, says, "I believe that at some level of his artistic consciousness, Tennyson knew that the image of the dominating meal propounded by his culture was an illusion, yet it did not reflect the truth of the meal experience. Yet despite his awareness of the illusory nature of this stereotype, despite his recognition of the psychological sense of alienation which resulted from adherence to these cultural precepts, Tennyson was nevertheless mesmerised by the illusion, positing it as a standard to which all men must strive, or else risk losing their meal essence." And I think this is absolutely right. O'Brien talking about Tennyson in his gendered masculine heroes. And I think that works more generally for Tennyson's heroism as well. I think to an extent he does recognise, just as the poet Everard Hall recognises, that his poem is kind of worthless. He can't let go of it. The whole poem, the construction of that poem, can't let go of the idea that Arthur might be possibly a contemporary hero. He can't let go of the idea that the Duke of Wellington might possibly be a model for the contemporary statesman. And probably knowing that it's an illusion, but nevertheless being mesmerised by it, as O'Brien says, Tennyson writes about these heroes as falling away and yet representing the only possible hope for the 19th century.